the Vethkali choir mind tasted the human vessel before it fully arrived. That was not a metaphor. Electromagnetic sensation was the choir's primary sense, an inherited gift from ancestors who had once navigated the magnetosphere of a gas giant by feeling the shape of its field lines the way a human might feel wind on skin. The confluence of 340 bonded ships drifted in loose formation across the sheer, each vessel extending its sensor web in the practiced overlap that turned individual perception into something richer and stranger. Collective experience, layered like sediment, each ship's reading informing every other's. When the human vessel dropped out of faster-than-light transit 800 kilometers off the gravity gradient's edge, the confluence felt it simultaneously, a single shared shiver that was not fear and not excitement, but something the Vethkali had never needed to translate into any other species' terms, because until recently they had not expected to need to. The vessel was wrong in several important ways. Its mass was consistent with a mid-range combat platform, the choir noted, cross-referencing against 11 months of accumulated intelligence on human military architecture. Its energy output was consistent with a crew complement of 300 to 400. The choir's best models had settled on 340 as the most probable figure, though the margin of error remained uncomfortable. Its weapon signatures were active and warm, which was honest at least. What was not consistent, what produced in the choir's shared processing something analogous to a parsing error, was that it was alone. The Vethkali did not have a word for a military vessel that arrived at a contested boundary without its fleet. They had a word for vessels that had been separated from their fleet by damage or catastrophe. They had a word for vessels deployed as bait. They had a word for vessels sent as death offerings in certain, obsolete ritual contexts that the choir retained in its deep archives with the careful neutrality of a civilization that had moved past such things and wished to remember why. None of these words fit cleanly. The vessel was not damaged. It did not present as bait. It was moving not toward the confluence, not toward the sheer itself, but in the slow, patient arc of something that was waiting to be noticed. The elder choir, those ships whose bonding stretched back 4 centuries, attempted to model the scenario. Their processing occupied 17 seconds, an eternity in choir time, the equivalent of an extremely long pause. Their conclusion was unknown. This was nearly unprecedented. On the bridge of the Perseverance Asterisk, Lieutenant Commander Yara Osai watched 340 alien vessels do absolutely nothing, and she breathed very carefully and did not allow herself to celebrate yet. She had been watching them for 9 minutes. Before that, she had spent 4 months watching them in recorded intelligence feeds, studying the movement patterns of the Vethkali confluence the way a naturalist studies a murmuration, not trying to predict individual motion but trying to understand the shape of the whole. She had noticed in those feeds a pattern that the tactical analysts had categorized as response latency, and she had categorized as thinking. The confluence thought together. It was slower than individual decision-making and faster than committee. It was something she didn't have a precise word for, so she'd started calling it breathing, because that felt closer to right. Right now, the confluence was breathing hard. "They're running their models," she said to the empty bridge. She had sent her crew to secondary stations 2 hours ago, before the transit. This was not because she was performing solitude, though she was aware that the performance of solitude, the fact of a single human on a single bridge, was part of the message. It was because if something went catastrophically wrong in the next 30 seconds, she did not want them on the bridge with her when it did. Nothing went catastrophically wrong. She reached across the console and opened a broadband channel, not the encrypted military frequencies the Vethkali would recognize as negotiation protocols, not the emergency distress bands they would read as surrender. The broadband that her signals team had spent 6 weeks analyzing, and then another 6 weeks arguing about, because it sat in a range the Vethkali used for something the analysts called choir ambient. The constant low-level, electromagnetic murmur the bonded ships exchanged with each other, the biological equivalent of a heartbeat made audible. She had not asked permission to do this from Earth Command. She had submitted a recommendation and received a response of insufficient data for authorization, which was the kind of answer that a different officer might read as a no. Yara had read it as an invitation to collect more data. "This is Lieutenant Commander Yara Osai of the Perseverance Asterisk," she said, into a channel that she was not certain anything was listening to in a way that would produce comprehension. "I am alone because I decided you deserve to be spoken to directly, rather than through the mathematics of a fleet formation. I don't know if that makes sense to you. I'm going to keep talking until one of us figures out what does." The confluence received the transmission. It processed for a long time. The Elder Choir had no category for this. The transmission was not a tactical signal. It was not a query in any of the contact protocols the Vethkali had developed with other species, none of which had gone especially well. It was a biological organism speaking into empty space in a way that resembled, the choir searched its archives, that resembled the behavior of certain creatures on the Vethkali homeworld that had not survived the civilization's early industrial period, creatures that had communicated by singing into the dark and waiting for an echo. The choir noted this, filed it, returned to it 11 times in the following 4 minutes. On the Perseverance Asterisk, Yara pinned a photograph to the console edge, pressing the corners down with her thumb until it held. 340 faces, taken at the crew assembly the day before departure. She had asked everyone to look at the camera, and most of them had, except engineer Kofi Asant, who had been in the middle of explaining something to the person beside him, and whose face was caught in the expression humans make when they are entirely absorbed in the process of making another person understand a thing they find beautiful. She did not look at the photograph again, but she left it there. The Vethkali sensors, trained on the Asterisk Perseverance Asterisk S hull, registered a micro-variation in the vessel's thermal signature, a hand pressed briefly against a surface inside, leaving a ghost of warmth in a small and specific shape. The choir noted this. It did not know what to do with it. It was still thinking about it when Yara opened the channel again and began to describe, in careful and unoptimized language, the gravitational mechanics of the shear, which she had spent 4 months studying, and which she suspected the Vethkali understood far better than any human currently alive, and which seemed like a reasonable place to start. The Vethkali formation spoke first, in the only language both species currently shared, geometry. 12 ships at the confluence's forward edge rearranged themselves across 11 minutes into an angular figure that the Perseverance Asterisk S computer flagged as non-tactical, and Yara flagged as deliberate. She pulled out the notebook she kept for things the computer was not useful for yet, and she sketched the shape, and she looked at it for a long time. It was not a threat formation. It was not a defensive screen. It was something that, if she rotated it in her mind and applied the reading conventions of Vethkali deep structure mapping, which she had also spent 4 months studying, resolved into something resembling a question mark. Not the human punctuation, but the underlying semantic. We are uncertain what to do with you and are indicating this uncertainty directly. Yara considered her options. She had, as it happened, a great many of them. She opened the broadband channel and said, "I see that. I'm uncertain too. That seems like a reasonable starting point." What happened next was not in any of the models. 6 ships detached from the main confluence, a subchoir she recognized from the intelligence feeds, a functional unit capable of semi-independent action, still tethered to the larger collective's processing, but able to move and act and perceive with a degree of local autonomy. They moved toward the Perseverance at a speed that was not combat approach and not casual transit, but something she had no good word for. Purposeful. Careful. The way you move toward a thing you want to examine without frightening. She had standing orders that covered this scenario. The orders said, "Do not allow boarding without authorization from Earth Command." She thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. She opened the internal channel. "Kofi, I need you in the forward docking bay. Don't bring anything tactical. Bring whatever you'd bring if someone was coming to visit." There was a brief silence. Then Kofi said, "Are we having guests?" "We might be." Another pause. "Should I make tea?" "Yes," she said, "make a lot." The 6 ships docked along the Perseverance *S secondary hull with a precision that suggested they had studied human vessel architecture in some detail. The contact was gentle. There were no weapon signatures. There were, instead, a series of electromagnetic pulses that the Perseverance *S computer translated as, "We are entering your structure. We are announcing this," which was, Yara thought, a remarkably civilized thing to do. The Vethkali did not have bodies in the way humans use the term. Each ship was a body, a vast, distributed organism whose consciousness lived in the electromagnetic field generated by its bonded crew, thousands of small beings in complex symbiosis, their individual nervous systems long since rewired by generations of selection pressure into nodes of a collective. What moved through the Perseverance *S corridors was the physical interface they used for close contact operations. 6 articulated sensory platforms, roughly 2 meters long, covered in fine electromagnetic receptor cilia that the crew had been briefed on, and most of them were staring at anyway. The platform that Yara was thinking of as the lead one stopped in the corridor outside the docking bay. It rotated slowly, taking in everything. Yara stood at the bay entrance and let herself be examined. She had worn her uniform. She had left her sidearm in her quarters. She had put her hands at her sides, not clasped behind her, not hovering near her belt, just present, clearly visible, not doing anything threatening. The platform cilia moved. The choir processed what it was seeing. It had expected a military unit. It had models for military units, efficient, hierarchical, each member's function legible from their positioning and equipment. What it found in the corridors of the Perseverance was a military unit, technically, in the sense that the beings aboard wore matching clothing and had ranks and were capable of organized violence. But they were also, the choir's processing slowed here, working hard. They were also greeting each other in the corridors, making sounds at each other that the choir's linguistics archive coded as socially bonding vocalization. One of them, passing the sensory platform, made eye contact with its visual receptor array, paused, and said something that the choir's translation engine rendered as, "Welcome aboard," and then continued walking, as though this were normal. The choir was not sure it was normal. The choir was not sure of many things right now. The platform followed Yara to the room she had indicated. Engineer Kofi Asant was there, and he had, in fact, made tea. He had made a great deal of it, in a large thermal container, and he had set out cups, human cups, because he had not known what else to do, and he was standing beside the table when the sensory platform entered, and he looked at it with the expression of a man confronting something he finds both alarming and extremely interesting, which Yara had come to recognize as Kofi's default expression when confronted with new information. He said, "Hello." The platform cilia oriented toward him. He said, "I don't know if you drink things, we drink things, this is tea, it's warm. Humans find warm things." He paused, visibly searching for the right word. Humans find warm things comforting. When someone comes to your home and you want them to feel welcome, you give them something warm. He looked down at the cup in his hands, which he was now holding for no particular reason, and then looked back up at the platform. "I thought it was worth trying." The platform cilia moved across its receptors in a wave. In the choir's processing, something was happening that the elderships had not experienced in 4 centuries of bonded existence. The 6 ships of the subchoir were transmitting back to the confluence a reading that kept generating anomalies, because the beings aboard this vessel were not operating as the choir's models predicted. They were not a hive. they shared no electromagnetic bonding. Their individual nervous systems were entirely separate. The choir had confirmed this with its medical sensor suite and was still not entirely satisfied with the finding. Because the data implied they had no mechanism for collective thought and yet were collectively functioning as though they did, as though the bonds between them were constructed from some other substrate entirely. Not biology, not chemistry, something the choir did not have adequate instrumentation to detect. The platform's sensory cilia extended, very slowly, toward the warm cup in Kofi's hands. It did not take the cup. It was assessing, recording. The thermal gradient of a warm thing held between two hands was entering the choir's archive alongside the thermal ghost of a hand pressed against a hull from the inside, and the choir was assembling these data points into a model that was still incomplete, but was beginning to have, at its center, a shape it recognized. The Vethkali had a concept, very old, from the pre-bonding philosophical traditions that the modern choir kept in its deep archive, with the complicated reverence one has for ancestors who did not survive to see what they had started, for the observation of a mind that had not been categorized as mind. A moment of recognition across what had seemed like empty space. They had a word for it that translated imprecisely as asterisk witnessed. The subchoir transmitted the word back to the confluence. The confluence received it, thought about it for a long time, then transmitted back, continue. In the Vethkali Deep Archive, there was a record of the first time two choir ships had bonded. Not the first ships, which was lost to prehistory, but the first recorded bonding, 1100 years prior, an event the modern confluence referred to as the first entanglement. Two ships that had been operating independently for decades, their individual electromagnetic fields gradually synchronizing through proximity until the boundary between them dissolved and something new emerged. A we that was not merely two eyes in proximity, but a different kind of mind entirely. The elder choir thought about this record often, in the days that followed the *Perseverance*'s arrival. What arrived on the sixth day was not another human vessel. It was two sets of orders, transmitted simultaneously from opposite directions. Earth Command ordered the *Perseverance to withdraw to the outer marker pending formal diplomatic authorization. The Confluence's coordinating authority, a body of elderships whose decision-making the choir respected and periodically ignored, ordered the subchoir to return to main formation and re-establish standard positioning along the sheer boundary. Yara read her orders twice. Then she walked to the communications room, where 7th of Peripheral, the designation the subchoir ship had developed for itself over 6 days of increasingly semi-autonomous operation, a development the Confluence was monitoring with something between alarm and fascination, had established a quasi-permanent sensor link. 7th of Peripheral was doing something the elder choir had no clean precedent for. It was holding a thought without transmitting it, just keeping it, turning it over. The thought was the memory of Kofi's hands around a warm cup, and the memory of the photographs Yara had shown it on day 340 faces, and the memory of the sound the crew made in the corridors when they passed each other, the constant low-level social murmur that the choir had eventually recognized as functionally equivalent to choir ambient, a species producing, through sound and gesture and proximity, the kind of continuous contact that the Vethkali produced through electromagnetic field overlap. Not biology, something else, something chosen moment to moment by creatures who had no biological imperative to do it. 7th of Peripheral found this, in the untransmitted privacy of its developing interior, extraordinary. Yara stood in the communications room and looked at the sensor interface and said, "We've both been ordered to leave." The cilia moved. "I am not going to follow that order," she said. "I want to be clear that this is my decision and that I am aware of the consequences. I am also going to guess that you have been given a similar instruction." The Cilia moved differently. "The shear is not ours," she said. "It is not yours. It belongs, if that's even a meaningful concept, to the 3 billion organisms whose food chains depend on it staying intact. The gravitational seeding cycle is 11 years. If this boundary dispute escalates to active conflict and the shear gets caught in the crossfire, we are looking at a minimum 30-year disruption. I have done this math. I believe you have also done this math." She reached across the console and pulled up a document she had been working on for 3 days. It was not a treaty. It was not a diplomatic proposal. It was a statement of fact. On this date, at these coordinates, the following things happened. Written in both languages, or as close as she could get to both languages, with the Vethkali portions rendered in the electromagnetic notation that Seventh of Peripheral had spent 4 days helping her calibrate. At the bottom, she had written a note in English. "This document is not a treaty. A treaty requires authority I do not have. This is a record of what happened here. Records are how my species makes things permanent." She transmitted it. The Confluence received it. The Elder Choir read it. All 340 ships, simultaneously, their processing interlocking across the full breadth of the Confluence's bonded intelligence. They read the document that a single human officer had produced with the assistance of a sub-choir ship that was developing, apparently, an interiority, a ship that had begun to keep thoughts private, to hold experience without immediately broadcasting it, to do something that in any other context the Confluence would have called growing. The Elder Choir conferred for a long time. Then the Confluence did something it had not done in recorded history. It transmitted on the choir ambient band, the deep, low-frequency electromagnetic murmur that was the closest thing the Vethkali had to a voice, simultaneously with the Perseverance *S broadband transmission, Yara having opened the channel the moment she saw the Confluence orient. 2 signals, broadcasting together from the same coordinates, in 2 different languages staking a co-claim. Earth Command received it. The Coordinating Authority received it. Neither, Yara reflected, could easily respond with force to an action that had already been logged in 2 species communication records, witnessed by every ship in sensor range, and which both parties had signed, if you use the term loosely, which she was prepared to do jointly. Neither fired. The shear continued its 11-year cycle, uninterrupted. The mineral gradients seeded downward through the gravity tidal zone into the feeding currents of organisms that did not know what politics was and were having a good year. Kofi brought tea to the communications room at some point because he was Kofi and left it without making a production of it. Yara drank it while she drafted the message to Earth Command that began, "I have additional data for your consideration." In the sub-choir ship that was becoming Seventh of Peripheral, something had shifted in the past 6 days that the Vethkali philosophical tradition did not have clean language for. The concept of an interior, a self that held experience without immediately distributing it to the collective, was not new to Vethkali history. It was very old. It was, in fact, the state from which the first entanglement had emerged. 2 ships that had been alone and had reached toward each other across the distance, and had found that the reaching changed what they were. Seventh of Peripheral was learning to be alone with a thought. It was not comfortable. It was not uncomfortable. It was, in the way that new kinds of perception are always new, something it did not yet have a word for. It was thinking about this, sitting with it, turning it, in the private space it was learning to inhabit, when it noticed, through its sensor cilia still linked to the Perseverance *S hull, a change in the vessel's external surface. At the forward docking junction, where the sub-choir's 6 ships had made contact on day 1, a marking had been made. Not human markings. The crew had not done this. The 6 ships of the sub-choir, in the process of undocking and returning to main confluence formation, had used their docking arms to inscribe something in the vessel's hull, a Vethkali formation glyph, the ancient notation for a concept from the pre-bonding archives, pressed into the metal in lines no wider than a finger. Witnessed. Yara found it 3 hours later when she was doing her walk of the hull. She stood at the docking junction with a torch and read it. She could read it now, after 4 days of calibration work with 7th of peripheral. And she stood there for a moment in the dark between the stars with the shear's gravitational tides pulling amber light across her sensor feeds. And then she took out her notebook and wrote down the glyph's coordinates. Then she went inside and filed a hull modification report with engineering, as regulations required, and in the field marked asterisk identification marks, she typed the glyph's notation and its translation. Witnessed. The Perseverance carried it into every port after that. Dock crews asked about it sometimes, and Yara or Kofi or whoever happened to be nearby would explain, and the explanation was never quite the same twice, because it was the kind of story that changed shape depending on who was telling it and who was listening. But the mark on the hull did not change. The Confluence moved on, carrying 7th of peripheral within it, a ship that was becoming something new, slowly, in the private space of an interiority it had not known it could have. And the shear continued its long, slow work of seeding minerals into the deep, and the 3 civilizations whose food chains depended on it continued, for another 11 years and another after that, without knowing anything about a single human vessel and 6 ships of a Vethkali subchoir who had, in the space of 6 days, looked at each other across an abyss that neither had expected to bridge and reached.